My name is Amélie Gagnon, and I'm leading the development unit at the UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. As you know, for the last decades, IIEP has been working on different aspects of the interface between law, rights, education, and policy, and especially how policies such as the regulation of the private provision of education can affect access, equity, and overall development. And so this series of webinar has been designed to take stock of the most recent research in the area of equity, privatization, and the right to education. So it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Frank Adamson to this webinar again for the third time already. And so Frank, you are Assistant Professor of Education, Leadership, and Policy Studies at Sacramento State University. And you study how different political and economic approaches to education relate to student experiences and opportunity in schools and communities. This webinar series is a four-part program. The first week, so 2 weeks ago, we had an introduction to the privatization of education, so the different forms and diffusion. Last week, we compared approaches, so taking lessons from different education systems, and we had a guest, Tony Verger, that was with us. And so this week, we're looking a bit forward, moving forward, delivering education as a human right. And so this will be the program for today. And next week, we will have a final conclusion and discussion on perhaps way forwards. So this week, Frank, you'll be joined by our colleague Ashina Mtsumi. She's a human rights researcher and activist, now pursuing an LLM at University of Pretoria. So you will introduce her in more details in a minute, but it's a pleasure to have you both. So we thank you for your engagement in this webinar series, and we look forward to hearing you today. In order to fully benefit, let's say, or enjoy the webinar series, we have a dedicated webpage. So you have the link here, and we'll put it in the chat. And all the resources of the webinars will be posted here. So recordings, slides, reports that we might mention, everything will be on that webpage. You can follow the discussion on Twitter also, tagging IIEP, tagging us, and these hashtag IIEP webinars and right to education. Now, to fully enjoy the webinar, we invite you to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So you will see a double bubble icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And of course, you can select interpretation for the language of your choice. So without further ado, Frank, I will leave the floor to you so that you can take us through the program for today. And I will be monitoring question and answers so that we can exchange a bit later in the event. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Amelie, and thanks to IIEP for a great job in hosting this webinar series. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. And okay. So welcome everybody. It's great to see such a global audience for this webinar series. And today we are joined by Ashina Mtsumi. She studies human rights law. I'm not a lawyer, so I wanted to bring somebody who understands the legal side of our topic today on the right to education to really help us dive into the Abidjan Principles and in general, the right to education. But I have been studying for a little while and I'll offer some thoughts on that. So, but first, just to remember, as Amelie already said, you know, we had our first session on the forms and diffusion of privatization. Then we had Tony Verger last week, and I'll cover some of just one brief, very important point that he made last week. And then today we're joined by Ashina, talking about delivering on education as a human right. And then finally, next week, we'll be joined by Camilo Crosso, And just to plant a seed, you know, it's a summary and a final discussion and key conclusions, but also an expansion. Camilla will talk about higher education, early childhood education, and we'll expand into COVID. And, you know, we don't have a lot of data on these things, but there are questions about how education is going to move forward. So how do we take this conversation in a new direction? So this is our, you know, a little bit more in detail on the recap of the first webinar. So just to remind you, we were putting together the puzzle pieces of funding, management, and ownership in education privatization in the first webinar. And we talked about vouchers and charters, low-fee private schools. And there was a question on different forms. And I encourage you to go back to that. There was one slide on there that talks about the pathways. And honestly, it was too rich a slide to really talk all the way through in a short webinar. So I encourage you to pull that up from the resource page at IAP and see the different mechanisms for which privatization can happen. And then we looked at the global heat map of diffusion. And then last week, we turned our attention to evidence and quality and achievement, where we saw that the results were mixed at best, but that there were concerns about segregation and overall equity, and that there are different ways of running our education system from a sort of economic perspective in terms of public investment. Oops, wrong way. So just to show this slide again from Tony, he has this meta-analysis where he's looking at different studies of different forms of what he calls PPP modalities, public-private partnership modalities. And we saw that the learning outcomes vary by modality, but they're not they're a little bit more in voucher programs and targeted vouchers specifically, as he talked about, but that the equity concerns are very strong in these programs. And I just think it's a very important finding globally when you look at not just one study, but the amalgamation of studies to show this level of concern. And then you all, everybody has been engaging in the chat box, and I've thematicized some of the topics. So there is this question of how politics and policy interplaying in privatization and in different areas, right? So in Sweden, we talked about the evolution of the system from social democracy orientation towards a fairly sharp shift in the early 90s towards marketization. And now there is a question, one of the co-authors of the book, Bjorn Strand, is working on an equity analysis at the national level in Sweden. So there is an ongoing conversation happening. It's not just a unilateral situation as in any policy context. And then in emerging and fragile states, you know, in the heat map that we produced, we actually flagged different states with high out of school populations, because we think that's where, honestly, today's topic of conversation, the right to education, the states are either unwilling or more likely unable to fulfill their right to education. And so how do we as a global community step up and make sure that that's happening? And how do we understand the obligations that we've already made, the commitments over the last 70 years in treaties that is really the root of the Abidjan Principles. And then there's a question of, you know, are these affects the symptoms of underlying social segregation instead of just the issues within the system in it. And that, I think, is certainly an issue that I'm researching right now. I'm working on a project sort of delineating what happens within education and how much it costs to deliver education within the school system, and then how much it would cost to actually sort of ameliorate the social issues that often appear in our education systems. So I think that's a very smart question. It's not, I don't have a concrete answer of, oh, this is in this bin and that's, I mean, everything is mixed up. So we're trying to sort the best we can. And these are important questions to consider about how we run our societies, not just our education system in terms of segregation. On the privatization of higher education, that question I'm putting in here as a reflection of our conversation next week. Where Camilla is going to touch base on that. And then again, with the PPP models, I wanted to reference you to Tony's work, where he outlines the different PPP models, not just by type, but also subtype. And he didn't have a lot of time last week, but just to say that, you know, there's a different type of voucher. There's a universal voucher, and then there's a targeted voucher where you're only trying to help certain groups. So it's this different subtypes, and that's really one of the key parts of his excellent analysis, is that he really dives into the details. So I encourage you to look at that piece more in depth. So today we're going to talk about a brief introduction to the right to education, which I'm going to do, and then we'll turn to Ashina to hear about the Abidjan Principles, and she'll take us on somewhere between a tour of the principles and a deeper dive, because there are a lot of principles. So we've really gone into the organization of them, so that, you know, at the end of this conversation, you can go into the principles and you'll have a roadmap, and you'll know where to look for things and find things that are germane to what you want to know about the right to education. And then we'll talk a little bit about the implementation at the end. So very briefly, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are sort of our guiding star of international commitments right now. And it's a new approach in education in terms of highlighting and focusing on the equity in education. So I just want to lay that out there, that in discussing the human right to education, there's the education lens and the human rights lens. And what we're trying to do is really combine those and understand how they intersect and how they inform each other. So this is sort of our education lens of the SDGs. And then when we look at this map, we're starting to get into how do we balance human rights, and you'll see equity and outcomes as the key evidentiary areas that we talked about last week. And those are kind of on this, you know, the scale of justice. And the topics that are covered in very broad sense in the Abidjan Principles are this equality and non-discrimination, free quality public education, the humanistic nature of education, regulated and respective of national standards, and due process. And so for these topics, there's this red line below which the delivery would then essentially constitute a human rights violation. You're not actually delivering as a state on the human right in any one of these areas. So as this scale tips, you know, and how we measure this in education is different than how we measure it in human rights. So what we're trying to do, so in human rights, the outcome is the enjoyment of the right to education, whereas in education, we talk about an outcome as, say, attainment or achievement or something like that. So how do we have this conversation about how we're delivering on human rights and then combining these two different frameworks? I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So at this point, we want to just do a little bit of a poll to whet your appetite like we've been doing before. And today's question is, who is demanding or driving demand for education privatization in your context? And you can choose more than one today. The options are parents and caretakers, national or subnational governments, international governmental or institutions, like the World Bank or something else, private companies and actors. So we'll give it a minute for everybody to participate.
So the poll should appear right now on your screens. So as Frank said, you can answer multiple. You can make a multiple selection of your answers. And so to identify who is driving the demand for education privatization in your context. So the question, the participants are still voting, so please don't hesitate to vote. We're curious to see what is the driving force in your context.
Okay, so the number of votes is starting to slow down. So I'll give it another 10 seconds and then I'll end it.
Thanks, Camila.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. So private companies are the top identified drivers of demand, followed by parents, national, and then international institutions. Okay, that's very helpful. That's very interesting. I think we're seeing the different ways and really this tension between private companies driving the demand and also parents wanting what's best for their children. So they're also actively seeking out options and trying to figure out how to get the best education for their children, which is what we want them to do. Great. So without further ado, let's bring Ashina into the conversation. So Ashina is a human rights researcher and advocate. She looks at human rights principles across different sectors. Hi, Ashina. And she has worked with the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as part of the Secretariat for the Abidjan Principles. And she's studying right now human rights and democratization in Africa at the Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria. So thank you, Ashina. Please go ahead and lead us through the Abidjan Principles.
Thanks, Frank. And hello to everybody. It's very exciting to continue this conversation, timely and important conversation. Yes, and Frank has done a very comprehensive introduction. I'm not going to add anything to that, and we can go right into the principles. So as Frank mentioned, I was part of the secretariat that was that supported the development of the Abidjan Principles on the right to education. And what are the Abidjan Principles? So they are first and foremost a legal text that clarifies states' human rights obligations to provide public education and to regulate private involvement in education. I should flag that that title is very deliberate. Public and private are two sides of the same coin, but by far the public side should be prioritized. And as we'll see, the law does put it first and foremost. Secondly, they reflect existing human rights law. So these are treaties and conventions that states have already committed to and already agreed to be bound by. So they don't create any new legal obligations. They don't need any ratification from states. So this is where states agree to be bound by. They don't need to formally agree to be bound by the Abidjan Principles. Just the fact that they already committed to the other treaties and conventions, and we'll look at a couple of them in a few minutes, means that the provisions in the Abidjan Principles are already applicable to states. And finally, and I think my favorite is that they're a practical tool, because it's one thing to say that we have a right to education, but what does that mean for states? You know, what should they do? Where should they start? And that the Abidjan Principles are supposed to provide a more concrete guidance to states and to other education actors towards implementing the right to education. And in this case, they're particularly reflecting on the context of private actor involvement in education, which Frank and the other guest speakers have covered comprehensively in the two preceding webinars. Next slide, please. So human rights law. Why human rights law? Why does it matter? This slide shows the ratification status, which is just how many states have committed to be bound by these two conventions. So the first is the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which includes the right to education. And the other is the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which also, of course, includes the right to education. And you can see that they both have near universal ratification. So almost all states have agreed to be bound by, and those that haven't have committed to other instruments or other legal texts that include a right to education. I'm gonna just spotlight on the US here because it's the one that has refused to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this obviously shows how much consensus there is on, first, that education is crucial, that education should be a right, and that states commit, because the fact that they've ratified means that they're committed to ensuring that that right is fulfilled. It doesn't remain theoretical, but it becomes a practical, actually realized and enjoyed right for everyone. Next slide, please. So the drafting process of the Abidjan Principles, it was comprehensive, I think. It stands out for being very comprehensive. Go ahead, Frank, and bring out all the elements. Thank you. I think the process really covered a number of years. It went on over about 4 years and was multidimensional, trying to bring together lived experiences, expert opinions and expert analysis on the right to education, and application to themes. So a number of consultations across different regions were held at Bangkok and Nairobi. Bangkok for the Asia and Pacific region, Nairobi for the Eastern Africa region. There were northern consultations in Paris. There were also community consultations. So we went to communities where people are experiencing challenges enjoying the right to education and discussed the, at that time, draft provisions in the Abidjan Principles and got feedback from the communities on what they need, what needs to be covered. There was also an online global consultation. So this was open to everybody to give their input. And we did receive approximately 200 responses, including from private sector. So this was not done aside, or it was not an ambush or a surprise for private sector. They also had an opportunity to provide input, and they did in fact provide comprehensive input. I know because I reviewed a lot of the input that we received to pass it on to the experts. And the actual drafting of the text was led by a drafting committee of 9 experts, chaired by Professor Anne Skelton, who's the UNESCO Chair for Education Law in Africa and a member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So she led this team of experts to do the actual drafting of the text, and their drafting process was informed by thematic research. So there are a number of background papers that will be published soon. Frank has been coordinating that and will tell us a little more about the publication date for that compilation of papers that looked at different themes. So first regional and also litigation and a number of other things that informed the experts who were drafting the principles. And this whole process was facilitated by a group of 5 civil society organizations, including GISCR, which is where I used to work. Next slide. Next slide, Frank. Thank you. So the adoption process of the Abidjan Principles, after these 4 years of research, of reviewing drafts and updating, finally in 2019, February, 57, sorry, not 57, but a number of experts came together in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, and over 2 days went through line by line the Abidjan Principles, what was the draft then, and ensured that first they reflected truly the legal position, that they were presented in a way that would be understandable, that would be practical, that would be easy enough to read, and just every little thing, and ensure that they all agreed to it before they then adopted it, basically. So there were about 20 experts, but they were joined by civil society who were observers. So they didn't participate in the drafting of it, but they did, during set aside intervals, give their input, their reflections, which would then be considered by the experts. But they were there as observers, so it was a purely expert-led process. And they were adopted on the 14th of February, 2019. So far, they've been signed by 57 experts, 60% of whom are from the Global South, and over 50% are women. So in terms of diversity, which is important for reflecting experiences from across the globe, the realities from across the globe, and different people groups, the principles have really endeavored to ensure that that has been catered for. Yes, next slide. So an overview of the document. As Frank has mentioned, they're very comprehensive. There are 97 guiding principles, which I think is reflective of just the complexity of the issue and how comprehensive it needed to be in order to address the different nuances that are at play. So there are 97 guiding principles, but these are arranged into 10 overarching principles. And then these 10 are cover different areas. And in today's discussion, we're going to look at just 4 key themes that run across the principles: public education, private education, partnerships, public-private partnerships, and accountability. And we'll connect those themes to the different overarching principles and the guiding principles. So in the next slide, you'll see the arrangement of the sections. And this is just to give you an idea of when you open the principles, what are you going to see? And how can you then navigate to find what you're looking for and make the connections? And I think it's also important just to flag that it's crucial to go through the document because a lot of things are interconnected. It would be very difficult to only read financing and then think that you have the full picture when it comes to financing public education, for instance, because you'll see section 2 discusses maximum available resources, which is connected to financing public education. So even as you think about where to begin, it's good to keep in mind that you might need to jump across to different sections of it. Next slide. So this is where you can find the Abidjan Principles, and the document on the left is the full text of the principles available on the website, and the one on the right is a summary leaflet that gives a snapshot of what the principles are, who was involved in the process, and the 10 overarching principles. A helpful summary to ease into it. So the first theme we'll look at is public education, and the principles under Guiding Principle 2 give a definition of public education. And they say that these are institutions that are first recognized by the state as public educational institutions, so public schools. Second, that they are effectively controlled and managed by the state. So by the state or by genuine representatives of the population that they serve, so the community where the school operates. And finally, that they are not at the service of any commercial or other exploitative interests that could undermine the learner's right to education. So these 3 are cumulative. It's not an either or. They all need to be at play for this particular school to be recognized as public, as put forth by the Abidjan Principles. There's also a definition of private, but you can look into that later. So with this in mind of what public education is, the principles then first put forward the right to free public education of the highest quality. This is under Principle 29. So states have an obligation under the right to education to ensure that they provide free public education of the highest attainable quality. Not only under the right to education are states required to just ensure that there's a system in place for anybody to set up schools, but in addition to this, and in fact in priority to this, there should be public schools available. They should be free and they should be for everybody. Equality and non-discrimination is also a key element of public education in particular, of course, but as we'll see, it's also fundamental when reflecting on private education. And there are comprehensive number of principles from 23 to 28 that unpack what equality and non-discrimination should entail. So issues like ensuring reasonable accommodation, ensuring that any schools or laws that in effect create inequality or discriminate against some learners should be amended. And then that's also addressed under determinants of access and inclusivity. So the principles take a very broad view, acknowledging that there are other things that impact on people's access to education. So for instance, housing policies or access to food or the minimum age for marriage, for instance. So they go broadly to look at other elements that would impact on access and inclusivity in education. And a highlight principle here, which relates to the importance, of course, of mobilizing resources, because this is not a cheap affair. It is resource intensive. And in acknowledging this, Guiding Principle 34 states that in allocating the maximum available resources for education, states must prioritize the provision of free public education of the highest attainable quality. This includes by allocating adequate financial and other resources for the realization of the right to education. So states, to demonstrate that they're serious about realizing the right to education, they need to allocate the funding, mobilize the resources first. So the principles do speak about reviewing their taxation regimes to ensure that it's progressive taxation, and in so doing, increasing the resources that will be available to allocate to education. And then as they are allocating resources to education, prioritizing free public education. Next slide, please. And now on private education. So I feel the need to affirm that there's a lot more to it, but this is just a very quick highlight. Please do read through the principles to get into more of the details and the meat of the provisions. So this next part is on private education, and just to connect to the scales that Frank had shown earlier, it's really an effort for states to balance between the competing obligations, the competing elements of the rights to education. So while there is an obligation to provide free public education, there is also the liberty, first for private individuals to set up, to establish private schools, and the liberty attendant to that for parents to choose private schools or guardians to choose private schools for the learners. So there's no obligation for everyone to have to take their children to public schools or for there to only exist public schools alone. The law leaves the space open for private schools to exist and for people to attend public schools, with the caution or the caveat that this is not an unconditional liberty. For this to operate in compliance with the right to education, the private schools have to meet certain standards, and there's an obligation on the state to make sure that it has set minimum standards for private schools to ensure that as they operate, they do not operate in a way that would violate or put at risk the right to education. And then that only those that meet those standards will then be allowed to operate. So Guiding Principle 49 affirms that private actors have a responsibility to respect the right to education and other human rights, including by avoiding causing or contributing to adverse impacts on the right to education through their own activities, and addressing and providing reparation when such impacts occur. B, by seeking to prevent or mitigate adverse impacts on the right to education that are not directly linked to their operations, products, or services, even if they have not directly contributed to those impacts. So private actors also have responsibilities under the right to education, and states are required to set additional standards that should be followed for them to continue. Yes, so basically balancing between this liberty and the obligations. The third theme is on financing, and this section reflects specifically on public-private partnerships in education. And the first provision under this is Principle 64, which affirms that there is no obligation on the state to fund private schools. However, and states must prioritize funding and provision of free quality public education and may only fund private institutions. And funding here is given a broad understanding. So it includes tax deductions or land concessions, international assistance, or other forms of direct and indirect support if they comply with the applicable laws and standards and observe the substantive, procedural, and operational requirements identified by law. So this one provision has a lot to it. So first of all, there's no obligation for states to fund private actors. They can't be forced to fund private actors. They must prioritize public education. However, in the event that they do consider funding private actors, first, it can only be those that are eligible. So there is a criteria for what private actors, what kind of private actors would be eligible to receive any funding from the state in the first place. And then there is a set of substantive, procedural, and operational requirements that are then set out in the following provisions of the Abidjan Principles. So that's from 65 straight to 72 that set out those requirements that have to be met before any funding can be allocated to a private actor. So funding, again, goes broader and looks at land concessions, for instance. And this takes us back to the typology that Frank had shared in the first webinar, I think, about the different elements that are at play for us to classify or consider a certain institution private, or that there is a private-public partnership at play. So land ownership or owning the land, would that amount to a private actor? Would then, so all of this is unpacked under the Abidjan Principles. Next slide. Yes, so this actually covers what I've just explained about the requirements. So some of the requirements include that there should first, the procedural requirements, there should be laws in place to regulate before any contracts are signed with a private actor. The state should demonstrate that it will have the capacity to monitor and will in fact monitor the partnership, the impact that it's having. There should be an exit clause. If upon review, it becomes apparent that the partnership is not working, it's having a negative impact on the enjoyment of the right to education, it should be possible to withdraw. And there should be a plan to ensure that as they withdraw, the learners who are in these institutions are not adversely affected. So it goes into these kind of details to ensure that the threshold is quite high, to be honest, that for the state to enter into any partnerships with a private institution. And in terms of institutions that would be eligible to begin with, I know some that are excluded are those that, just a moment, for instance, abuse the right to equality and non-discrimination, or those that charge fees that substantially undermine access to education, or those that do not comply with all of their domestic or international financial obligations, so they're taxing. And just to flag that this doesn't mean that the schools, private schools shouldn't operate. These provisions speak to when the state can provide support or funding or partner with these private institutions. Next slide. And the final theme on accountability and monitoring. This is important and it cuts across for both public and private education. And the first is for accountability under overarching principle 7, where the states are required to put in place adequate mechanisms to ensure that they are accountable. So for the state itself, that it can be held to account in the instances where it fails to meet its obligations, where its actions in effect violate the right to education for other people. So this includes ensuring that people can go to court and sue on the right to education, that and that there are that there are mechanisms in place to remind the state to do what it's supposed to be doing. Monitoring, of course, very connected to accountability, that the state regularly monitors both public and private institutions to ensure compliance with the right to education, to ensure that the operations continue to work towards fulfilling the right to education and that they're not now infringing on. So this continued monitoring also is supposed to be connected to transparency, because as they monitor, they should publish or make available the information that they find on what impact private schools are having, for instance, on the system, or where there's identifying challenges in the public system, and it's connected to then being able to hold these bodies to account. And the final slide, remedies, to ensure that it's not a zero-sum discussion, there should be remedies available. So this, under overarching principle 9, states must ensure that there are effective remedies where there are violations on the right to education by the state, or where there are abuses by private actors. So there should be mechanisms in place to ensure that wrongs are corrected. And next slide. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Frank here. I really rushed over all of this so that we have enough time to answer some questions and discuss, and I'm happy to do so. But over to you, Frank.
Thank you so much, Ashina. That was like walking into a library of the Abidjan Principles. So great. And so I am going to leave time for questions. So I'll just briefly conclude here with what's happening now. What's the vision? How did the Abidjan Principles move forward? And there is a significant ongoing recognition of the Abidjan Principles. Here are some of the areas and institutions that have recognized the Abidjan Principles: the UN Special Rapporteur, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I will come back to that in a second. As most of it is covered in a new book that is coming out. So we have compiled through some substantial effort, the background papers have been formulated into chapters, and this book is coming out in May of this year. Just sent the proofs out last night. And the chapters, you can see, are designed in the first part to really look at some of the legal issues around the human right to education. So what are guiding principles? Is there a right to public education? What do parents' rights mean in this situation? And what does funding look like in terms of rights? So just as Ashina was talking about, key issues that come up in this conversation, we're addressing them. And then the second part addresses the education side of the coin, like we've been talking about. So what's the evidence on school choice and the human right to education? Tony's paper on how and why policy design matters. The growth of private actors in East Africa, so that's a paper by Linda Odonoa, and then also looking at Francophone countries. And then finally, we synthesized, myself and Delphine and Magdalena synthesized the research on how you would strengthen the implementation. So we have sort of an implementation chapter at the end. And there are a couple of pathways here that I'm just going to highlight quickly. There's just increasing public awareness. So part of the purpose of this webinar and this whole series is how do people know that we all have a right to education? I think it just at a very macro level, sometimes that goes by the wayside. We don't even really know that we already agreed on this 70 years ago and have across multiple treaties for the last 70 years reaffirmed this right that we all have. And so it's our obligation, you know, as a human community and as states to actually fulfill what we've already agreed upon. And then how do we do that? So there's the building capacity and technical assistance side, and academic research to show us where we're not actually doing it or where we're doing it well, and we can improve upon those ways of doing it. And then, you know, when necessary, there is also the quite expensive, but sometimes necessary accountability and litigation that needs to be pursued. There's also just the social accountability initiatives of how do we change the conversation and really make it more about, you know, us delivering on our collective rights, and how do we collaborate with other movements. So all of these are laid out in chapter 10 of the book, and we are part of, say, the building capacity part. This in particular germane to this conversation happening in the IEP space is about engaging key actors and collaborating with international institutions. And, you know, on the second anniversary of the Abidjan Principles, the birthday, Amelie has said that Abidjan Principles can be used as a technical tool to identify key markers and targets that translate states' efforts into making the right to education a reality. And so that is reflective of what we're trying to do here, how such a great tool like the Abidjan Principles can be used in the work ahead of combining this framework for human rights with education frameworks. And I will say that I'm also publishing a paper on the global monitoring report that looks at the intersection of human rights and education with other co-authors. And I know that IEP is also working on indicator work of how do we better understand and incorporate human rights into our education systems at the thought level, at the indicator level, and at the delivery level. And so with that, I'll close the portion so we can actually get to some Q&A, but I will remind you that we do have this final discussion coming up next week, and we'll recap the major findings. We'll expand our frame to early childhood and education, and we'll look at the right to education in the context of COVID and climate change. And Camilla Crosso will be joining us. So let's open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Ashina. This is a really important presentation because I think that the Abidjan Principles, well, you quoted me, so I believe that they really have a technical value, because no one will be able to go through every single treaty, every single, you know, declaration to make sure that we can collect all the relevant pieces for addressing our own education sectors as we plan for the future. And so I really, and I want to commend the team that worked on these principles, because to be honest, I could react and provide some comments on the different drafts, and the level of collaboration and openness of the consultations, I think is really commendable. So I cannot stop congratulating the team for that work. We have a few minutes for Q&A indeed. I want to recall to participants that every week we go back to the chats, to the Q&As, and that's how Frank can build these first few slides about the topics that came up, and you'll answer a few additional questions and so forth. So don't worry if we don't address your questions right now. There will certainly be other opportunities for this. But I think that there were a few questions in the Q&A box that really address the principle 34 about the different available resources for education. Christine is asking, how can we separate public institutions from commercial or private services that they can use as Google, Amazon, Facebook to actually provide public education? Alejandra is asking, you know, how can we kind of classify what kind of resources are accepted or not. How do we set boundaries, and that type of reflection. And Bikalpa also is asking, how do we define a maximum required resources for education? It seems a bit, flexible and open. Yeah, so it seems that some boundaries are still to be defined, and we wanted to hear you about this specific point on educational resources. So I don't know if Ashina, you want to start, or Frank, shall you?
I'm going to put Ashina on the spot, and go ahead, because I think she's been dealing with this.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for all the questions. There's so many, and it's unfortunate we won't be able to go through all of them, but specifically on resources and guiding principle 34, because I see a lot of questions on that. I think it's interesting, Bikalpa, I hope I'm saying that right, what you flagged, that it seems subjective. And the challenge with international law is that it covers the whole world, right? So all the countries with all the different contexts and all the different challenges. So there is an effort to put down provisions that will be flexible enough, as Amelie said, flexibility is it, flexible enough to be applied, interpreted, and useful in the different contexts. So in this case, when we talk about how do you define maximum required resources or maximum available resources, I feel like for this, I need to add that, so education under human rights law, because it's so resource intensive, is one of the obligations attached to it is that it's to be realized progressively. So that states are supposed to take steps towards its realization. And that is connected to maximum available resources. So the first thing is that there's no one standard maximum available resource, like a sum that we can say across countries or even within the same country, that the states are supposed to be continuously increasing the resources that are available that can then be allocated to education over time. And there's one of the provisions within the principles actually that talks about states should be continuously raising the standards on the right to education, because we're supposed to be moving forward. So I think that speaks to why it's so flexible, because it will have to be moving. It has to be moving forward in all the different countries. It has to be moving forward. I hope that addresses your question.
Do you want to
And
add
then
it? Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, just because I'm looking at that question about competition. I think what the principles try to do is ensure that what's happening is not competition, but rather true choice. So they protect people's liberty to choose, but it has to be a real choice, right? So if someone has no access to a public school, there are only private schools around, that means that they are being funneled into making a particular choice. So having public and private schools operating in close proximity means more that people will have a genuine choice rather than that there will be competition. Yeah. Frank, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I would. I was also looking at that word competition because it comes up, and for me, it comes up as really a fundamental logic of how we orient our education system, right? And that's sort of the comparison between a market-based competition model where you have active sort of competing, and what my research and others' research have shown is when you put people and schools into that situation, you create a bevy of incentives for people to game the system. I've just watched loopholes be invented for the selection of students. And then it so often devolves into, okay, we're trying to get this marginal increase on our test scores or some accountability mechanism that we're trying to improve, instead of focusing on the human right, which is really, and I go back to 1948, the full enjoyment of the human personality is the human right to education. That's not, I can do better on a math assessment. right? There is a much broader delivery that's required that we've agreed upon. And I think that's critical. And then the question of how to, is it competition or not? In my perspective, competition has not yielded the same benefits as it has in, say, the technology sector, where people are choosing and it's a market-based sector. Because what happens is, so often you have so many people that get left behind in that model, which is fine when you're improving and iterating in technology. It's not fine when you're talking about people and students and children. And that's one of the dangers. And we really play that out in the Global Education Reform book. And this ties back into the resource question, right? So what do we mean by, I agree, maximum available is a very amorphous term. So, but we do have some key areas of education that have been shown over time across contexts to matter. And one of those is teachers. When you look at the systems that are doing really well, they place a high priority on the development and professionalization of their teacher labor force. So for me, if you're not doing that at a minimum level, you're not investing a maximum resource. And I mean, I could go on in terms of different examples, and I think this is where the intersection of education research and what we know about what works in different contexts can actually play a very important role in the in helping states on their pathway to the progressive realization of the human right to education. So I'll leave that comment there.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I see there's a lot of questions also on the you know, how to ratify, why not ratify, the issue against, you know, legally binding Abidjan Principles, what is obligatory or not, and so forth. So I'm not sure that a quick answer is possible for this. You can try. Yeah, let's do it very quickly.
Yes, I see that we only have 2 minutes, but just to try, because I've seen a number as well. I was typing one, but let me just explain that the Abidjan Principles do not need to be ratified by states. States don't need to sign the principles for them to then have to implement them. They already apply to all states because they compile provisions, they compile and unpack provisions from laws, international laws that states have already signed and already committed to. So the Covenant on the Rights of the Child and what it says about the right to education, all of that has been included here. So they already apply to states.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks a lot. I think I will put in the chat box one of your answers, Ashina, also to the fact, you know, we're facing a global education challenge, a global sanitary challenge. And so about the impact of COVID, the question was, will the Abidjan Principles be updated with the, you know, new situation provided to us by COVID-19? So I will put it on the chat box. I will just read quickly that you are sharing a report made by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Education, which also draws on the Abidjan Principles and flagged some of the risks to the right to education that are caused by COVID. And so I will also add these resources to the webpage of the webinar series. It's time to say thanks a lot to you, Frank, to you, Ashina, to the attendees, participants, to the interpreters. Thanks a lot for your participation today. We were about 213 still hanging in there and being present every week. So thanks a lot for everyone. I give you, as we say in French, a rendezvous. So let's meet again next week, same time. We'll send you Zoom links, and we will be able to close the discussion, to see how expand a bit the discussion and draw some conclusions for educational planning and management. So thanks everyone for joining, and let's meet again next week.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone.